Okay, welcome to everyone this evening to our MLE Friends. This is the second talk of the spring 2023 season of the MLE Friends series at Mind and Life Europe. We're really delighted this evening to have Dr. Martijn van Beek, a beloved MLE association and board member, offering a talk and leading a discussion with us this evening. His talk, which is entitled Caring for Contemplative Life, a Matter of Practice. The question mark at the end. So I'd like just to briefly introduce Martijn, although many of you know him well in the community. And then Martijn, I'll just give you the floor and you can get us started with your presentation and your slides. So Dr. Martijn van Beek is an associate professor of anthropology at Aarhus University in Denmark and is affiliated with the Interacting Mind Center there at Aarhus. Having previously spent many years working and conducting research in Ladakh and elsewhere in the Himalayan region, his current research explores the meeting ground between contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, consciousness research, and modernity. One of the goals of his current research is to contributing to refining our understanding of the significance of the spread of mindfulness and related forms of modern contemplative practice for people and for society today. He's also engaged in research on the microphenomenology of contemplative experience. And Martijn teaches contemplative life in context, in theory, and in practice at Aarhus University, also for the program called Training Empathy for Professionals Working with Children and Young Adults, hosted by the Danish Society for the Promotion of Life, Wisdom, and Children, and at Vækst Center, the international community where he lives in Denmark. So with that, Martijn, thank you so much for offering your time this evening and also your reflections. So I will be happy just to give you the floor, and then we'll have a discussion in the second part of the evening.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Vækst Center is an intentional community, not an international one, although there are a few Norwegians living with us. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. So what I'm going to be talking about is, can you guys see me? Yeah, you can see my slides. I can't see you guys, so that's why maybe I should do it like this. You couldn't see my slides, right? No, let me just share the screen. Okay, try again. Pushing the right buttons. That was better. Now I can still see you. What I wanted to talk about is really quite a sort of an overall view of the, you could say, the state of the dialogue and the state of the research that's been happening as a consequence of, or partly as a consequence of the Mind and Life work. And talk about some of the concerns that people have had, and familiar ones. So much of what I'll be talking about is probably familiar to most of you. And in a way, what I'm most interested in is the discussion that we can have after you've read a lot of my slides and listened to me speak. The reason I called it Caring for Contemplative Life is, of course, because we have the current theme in Mind and Life Europe called Caring for Life. And my point with the title is that there is a way in which contemplation is at risk, at least in the dialogue, quite often, of being reduced to meditation. Now, that is not to say that meditation isn't important, or that scientific research that has been going on isn't extremely beneficial and important to be continued also, but that there is a kind of narrowing of the understanding of what contemplative practice and contemplative life is. And I think we may be losing something there. And the big question is, how do we take care of contemplative life in this richer, deeper sense, at the same time as we acknowledge the importance and benefits of the essentialized practices of, for example, mindfulness, which are acceptable to many people and have brought a lot of benefit. So, and also I'm going to be drawing actually on a relatively few major sources. One of whom I should say is Brother David Steiner-Rast, in a way also to try and already signal something about the broadness of the field of contemplative life that Minor Life in a way is engaging in, and out of which the Minor Life dialogues also have emerged. So just have to move something here on my screen. No, it doesn't work. Why not? Okay. No, I can't see my cursor. I'm just going to jump out for a second so I can move this away. Okay, you're back. So contemplative life in all its forms and on all different levels is really a quest for living from the heart. It's a quest for the heart, says Brother David. And of course, one of the reasons to make that point is that a lot of the attention has been going to the brain, and that is not to say that people haven't been aware of the fact that more is involved when people practice than the brain, but the heart hasn't had nearly the same amount of attention. And when we look at what traditional what contemplative traditions themselves say, and what His Holiness also says, it is actually the heart that is very much in focus in contemplative practice. So the basic premise is that, the success of, as it says on the slide, we have this extremely successful research from the behavioral and cognitive neurosciences in particular that have been instrumental in making contemplative practices like mindfulness acceptable and of interest to many people. They've served also as a way of justifying people's engagement with these practices. So the whole discourse of evidence-based practice it has been extremely important. And what I'm saying is not a way to polemicize against that research, but rather to say, okay, so that's going really, really well. It has some consequences, but can we broaden the scope again of our understanding of contemplative life? And if we want to do that, this is more something for the discussion perhaps, how might we actually do that? And one of the reasons to bring this up is also because I want to look a little bit at where Mind and Life dialogues have come from. So and this is just it's not a complete map at all, but it is a couple of the places and times where events have happened, where in particular Francisco Varela has been present in various capacities, not in all of these, but in most of these. And that's in a way, as always, it's very, very useful to look at the history of these kinds of dialogues and look at the agendas that were on the table and what the larger vision is of why this work was seen as important. So we all know about the Lindisfarne Association that Evan Thompson's father started, and in which Francisco Varela also was involved for a number of years. So was Buddha David Steiner-Rast. The quote that I had in the earlier slide, I think, is from a talk. Well, it wasn't from the Lindisfarne talk, but it's actually from a paper, I think, that Brother David wrote back in the very early 80s, or maybe even longer ago. A really crucial moment in this whole development was the conference called Andere Wirklichkeiten, Other Realities, that took place in Alpbach in September 1983, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Another strain that is kind of, I wouldn't say fallen by the wayside, but it hasn't been as explicitly included in the Mind and Life work and Mind and Life Europe's work, has been art. The impulse that came from artists. There is a very interesting history about how Joseph Beuys, who was a prominent figure in a prominent artist, of course, but also a prominent figure in both the environmental movement and the peace movement in Germany. And him and a group of associates, avant-garde artists in a movement called Fluxus, were involved in thinking about ways in which art could be brought onto into a dialogue with, for example, spiritual traditions, but also politics and so on. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the people who was instrumental in some of these things happening, among them a meeting between Joseph Beuys and His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Bonn in 1983, I think, which was not very successful. But the person involved in organizing that was somebody called Laurien Weijers, who is a Dutch artist, who both had a connection to Joseph Beuys and Robert Filiou and other people in the Fluxus movement, also with Andy Warhol, who was marginally involved in this. And Laurien developed this idea together with Robert Filiou of organizing a meeting that would bring together the artists and the scientists and spiritual traditions. And then later, in the process of organizing that, they brought in economists as well. And in particular, one of the economists that participated in the meeting that took place in Amsterdam in 1990 was Menshikov, one of the architects of late Soviet and post-Soviet economics, and an important voice for compassionate economics, actually an idea that he was already working on, but the title, compassionate economy, was one that His Holiness, was a word that, or a concept that His Holiness used in a conversation at the 1990 meeting. And then, of course, the Mind and Life dialogues emerged beginning in 1987. So Francisco Varela was involved in Lindisfarne, in the Altbach meeting, in Art, Meets Science and Spirituality in a Changing Economy, and in the Mind and Life dialogues. The background to all this, which I think is important, is a sense of crisis that was prevalent in Europe after World War II. One major strain is the post-war peace movement. I already mentioned Joseph Beuys' involvement in that in Germany. But this whole idea of Nie wieder Krieg, that something needed to be done to prevent something like the Second World War happening again. Another strain had to do with the profound global inequality, north-south inequality, other forms of inequality, systemic racism, gender discrimination, and also the environmental crisis, awareness about which really started in the 1950s with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and sort of a growing sense of, life not being possible to continue living our lives the way we were doing, and looking at sort of the fundamental causes behind that, these multiple crises. And so we have these different social movements that were emerging at the time, especially in Europe also, or at least, I'm talking mostly about Europe in this context. Die Grünen, as I said, Joseph Beuys was involved in that, but also the founders of that, Petra Kelling, Gerd Bastian, were people from the left, but were very much interested in what was going on in Tibet also, and met with His Holiness also at different times. Then there was a peace movement and various initiatives towards global justice. So there was a sense that what was needed really was a new paradigm, there were lots of different kinds of initiatives going on. Overall, there is this term that Charles Taylor used. He wrote a really interesting book about it called The Secular Age, a period in which not having a faith or having a religion, having a spiritual tradition to which one ascribed had become a possibility rather than a given. And that this really changes, he thought or thinks, the way in which people understand themselves in relation to others and to the world. A sense of loss also in general characterized this period, a sense of loss of meaning in people's lives. Young people in particular, youth unemployment in Europe in the 80s was rampant, and the sense of impending doom because of the threat of thermonuclear war and economic crises. At the same time, was this extreme skepticism towards organized religion. And from a number of different sides, there was this idea that a secular spirituality might be part of the remedy. Not that this was a universally held belief, but it was one of the ideas that was articulated. So secular spirituality, again, is a concept where His Holiness the Dalai Lama has played a major role in promoting this and formulating it. And this definition here is one that Arthur Zions apparently quoted, it's in the proceedings in the book about the meeting, the Mind and Life meeting with His Holiness at MIT. So it's a spirituality that is simultaneously committed to experience, including meditative experience and reason, while being embedded in what His Holiness terms secular ethics. So there is this idea that, you know, the rational often gets equated with the scientific. So there is this way in which we need a bridging, a coming together of these two ideas. Houston Smith formulated this larger crisis of spirituality, or the loss of spirituality, as a fundamental cause. As you can see in this quote, you know, somewhere there is a basic tension out of which the present global crisis has grown, and it is related to the spiritual condition of modern civilization. This condition is characterized by loss of metaphysical certainties, of an experience of the transcendental and any kind of higher horizon. And he says it's strange, but ultimately quite logical. As soon as man began considering himself the source of the highest meaning in the world and a measure of everything, the world began to lose its human dimension and man began to lose control of it. There's a nice paradox there. So andere Wirklichkeiten, this meeting in Altbach took place in September there, and the people who were there, I don't know if this becomes too small on your screens, I'll just read you the participants. The invited guests were His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Richard Baker Roshi, I think then still the head of the San Francisco Zen Center, Brother David Steiner-Rast, David Bohm, Fridtjof Capra, Rupert Sheldrake, and Francisco Varela. And it was the first time where Francisco Varela actually met His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and apparently they hit it off quite well. Laurien Weijers, the person that I mentioned earlier, the Dutch artist, she was at the meeting also. Evan Thompson was also there. He told us recently. I didn't know that, but he was there as well. But Laurien was there, and she actually interviewed the main speakers right after they had this session with His Holiness. And here's a quote from the interview with Francisco. Says, for a while I was very excited about the possibility of building all these kinds of bridges, and for a long time I felt that there was a lot that could be said. But when you really try to work out the details and be respectful of both traditions, then you have to re-understand both of them until you create some kind of dialogue. So there is this expression of a hope, and both the transcript of some of what was said during the panel, during the discussions during this meeting, and Laurien's few words about the conversation she had during lunches and so on, and this quote from the interview with Francisco, all show that there is this, you know, there is a sort of a respectful but also quite sensitive engagement still at this time. So out of that came Mind and Life, but before turning to Mind and Life, I want to just look briefly at this meeting that Laurien organized in Amsterdam in 1990, Art Meets Science and Spirituality in a Changing Economy, which in a way had a broader scope than the Mind and Life dialogues, in the sense that it was really, you know, it was like a whole package. It was I forget how many days it was, but it was quite a lineup of people, and the discussions are very, very interesting. The videos of the panels are all on YouTube nowadays, and Laurien published the book that you see, Art Meets Science, on the left on this slide, is the catalog of the meeting in 1990, which contains interviews with all the invited speakers. Not everybody managed to show up, but it also includes a very interesting interview with Francisco that I will quote again a little later. The book on the right is the catalog again of the meeting, the follow-up meeting in Copenhagen in 1995. And it actually contains the transcripts or many of the transcripts of the meeting in 1990. So if you don't want to transcribe the video, get yourself a copy of the other book and you can just scan it. That's what I did. So then, of course, as we all know, the Mind and Life dialogues begin, and they started out with a very broad perspective. So his owner somewhere in and I couldn't find the source when I tried to put the slides together, but he mentions, there are these 5 sciences that are particularly interesting: this cosmology and physics and psychology and biology and cognitive and neuroscience, maybe something like that. So it was a very broad perspective on what this dialogue was about, and given the background, so given this, planetary crisis or multiple planetary crises and these existential crises that people were experiencing, the kind of despair around the world, it's understandable that, if we want to have this meeting with science and spirituality, a broad perspective is useful. And then, of course, there was this meeting that I think Cliff was part of on destructive emotions, and where there was this, in a way, a sharpening of the focus of Mind and Life and of the research. It really gave a big impetus to the research that was already, of course, in progress, but also a new impetus to work specifically on the effects of meditation on well-being, which has been, as we said earlier, very, very successful and important. So in the foreword to the second edition of, and there's been a lot of criticism of this as well, or concern about what the implications of this are. And in the foreword to the second edition, the new edition of The Embodied Mind, Eleanor Ross says somewhere that, when you have this kind of thing going on, then sometimes the science simply takes over like a colonial ruler. It's a very strong statement. I think it's quite polemical. I'm not sure I agree. I put up a picture of my own teacher and 2 students, and Andreas Rupstorff, and I'm taking the picture during an experiment that we were doing, just to see that, we do that too. So it's not to say, just to make a negative point about the scientific endeavor as such, but there is this concern, and I think it's justified. And actually, the concern was already voiced quite articulately by Thomas Merton back in 1968, I think. He talked about what he called the simple pharmacology of contemplation. And he says that this begins sometime in the 16th, 17th century, in the Renaissance, actually. But it's, it could have been written today. And he says, the idea was that if you set up the right conditions, kind of a laboratory for prayer, and if you carried out the experiment according to the instructions, you would get the desired result. A kind of you would get the desired result. You could work things out efficiently so that you obtained the precise kind of grace that you were looking for. This concept has by now evolved into the simple pharmacology of contemplation. You take the right pill and you turn on. Hence, the idea of discipline was corrupted into a kind of methodology, and instead of really praying and meditating, people became obsessed with their method and observed themselves at prayer, checking on the method and wondering why they were not getting the desired results. This transformation of a discipline in a broad human measure and in a theological climate of love and grace into a methodology of will and concentration has been fatal to Catholic contemplation. Again, very strong words. Now, Francisco Varela's project was, of course, not to domesticate contemplation, but to, in a way, open up science or to transform science. And this quote I've used many times also, but it's from the 1990 volume, the interview before the meeting in Amsterdam. And he says, "I don't think you can ever say that science and spirituality should be together. I would rather say that spirituality is a kind of perspective that pervades every human activity. If science is not able to live within that ecology, there's something wrong with science. I don't believe that intrinsically there is a problem. It's only when science takes itself to be the high priest of knowledge and pontificates that there is a problem. But in fact, the best science is not like that." So for me, that's really sort of the key, or a very, very important statement, because it acknowledges the strength of science and the importance of science, but also puts it in this broader context, which of spirituality as a more fundamental and more encompassing aspect of reality and of human experience. So as an example of these, I apologize for all those long quotes, but this is David Bohm speaking at the, actually speaking at the 1990 panel, and I think it's the panel where Francisco Varela also was present. And he makes this argument that science has to move and mankind has to move in a way from thinking about ourselves in the world in fragmentation. You know, His Holiness made a very, very similar statement in October, that, you know, he said something about thinking in terms of nations, us, you know, me and them and so on, that the time for that has passed. And this is David Bohm saying something very similar. You know, he says wholeness is an attitude or an approach, but it can be given a scientific realization, a form. We could develop our scientific theories in the form of wholeness instead of fragmentation. And in a way, you know, an activism is a form of that, in my understanding at least. He says, I think wholeness is a potential. It doesn't belong only to ourselves. It belongs to the whole situation of society and the universe. Wholeness will arise between us all, in participation rather than separately. We're internally related to everything, not externally related. Consciousness is an internal relationship to the whole. You know, that's another way of defining spirituality, an orientation towards the whole. We take in the whole and we act towards the whole, and whatever we have taken in determines who we are. There's a lot in that statement. So again, to go back to Francisco, he emphasizes the importance of training, that, you know, in order to live with groundlessness, his formulation of emptiness in the embodied mind and elsewhere, says what it comes down to is that confronting this lack of foundation immediately makes essential the need for human practice, learning, and transformation. I'm not going to read the whole quote. You know, spiritual work, it's practice, it's, you know, it's as he says, discipline, and he says engagement. People really taking stock of the capacities inherent in human beings and cultivating them, becoming more aware, more present, more sensitive, more compassionate, which is a core for me of spiritual work. And it takes discipline. And here and elsewhere, he in a way hints at that in some sense, this was more important to him, certainly as he became a little older, as he writes here, than the strictly scientific work. Not that he wasn't a committed scientist still, but this other aspect seems to have become more and more important for his way of being. Then there is this point that Michel Bitbol and Elena make in an article back in 2016. I forget the title, but they say, you know, the problem is that not everybody's ready to do that kind of work. You know, like how do you you know, it's very, very demanding to do this fully. So part of the point I want to make is that yes, it's necessary to, you know, for the full effect, so to speak, for the full so the full the full realization of human potential, or whatever you want to call it, would require an incredible amount of effort and time and energy and so on, and not everybody's ready to do that, which is why it is so important that we don't reduce contemplative practice to this unachievable ideal. Davish Ras somewhere says that it's really important we don't put the mystics on a pedestal, because you know, they don't belong there. We're all mystics. I have a different kind of quote from him that says something similar later. And so you know, there's sometimes a tendency to say, well, the scientifically, you know, modern mindfulness is a dumbed down version of the Dharma. And in a sense it is. But, you know, the Dharma has always had these more simple, you know, immediately relevant to many people kinds of practices that are actually more relevant and more beneficial for most people. So the idea that everybody, you know, unless I can be a full-time monk, a professional contemplative, there's no point in engaging, is simply not, you know, it's not right. And also the more sort of snobbish, elitist way of saying, well, you know, unless you're a proper contemplative, you know, your practice doesn't really count, is also a very unproductive way of seeing it, and is actually mistaken. So so the point of all this means, one of the points of all this is that practicing becomes central. And so everyday spirituality, everyday kinds of practices become a key to the contemplative life. And any kind of, even a minor practice counts, as it were. And it always involves the whole being. So these are different quotes that say basically the same thing. We need to bring in our whole being if we want to live a contemplative life and live it as a, it's always by definition an existential pursuit. How much we choose to bring into the explicitly contemplative orientation that we live from or towards is a matter of individual choice and circumstances. So how much of this we can realize, how far we can realize this is not given. But any kind of contemplative practice is an existential practice. It's not just, properly understood, just a matter of 5 minutes of meditation. Although that is part of contemplative life. And it is a valid form of contemplative life, it's just not the full form. And the focus of science on a very limited slice of contemplative practice has the danger of making people think that, the essence of Buddhism is meditation, the essence of meditation is mindfulness, and mindfulness happens in my brain when I sit on my pillow and count my breath or things like that. Of course, there's a much more sophisticated understanding of mindfulness out there as well. But this is the kind of concern that is often raised. So, how far are we? Okay. So one of the things that I'm interested in as the person I am, but also professionally as an anthropologist, is what I call emergent forms of contemplative life. So given that we have this incredible accessibility now of a wide variety of teachings, teachers, practices, literature about them, including scientific literature and so on, there is this incredible possibility to integrate elements from different contemplative traditions, as well as modern versions of that or reformulations of that into our lives. And how do people actually do that? What do people do with these different elements? How does a contemplative, not just the techniques and the practices, meditation, but in a general sense, how do people do that? And there are a couple of, I would say, continua. They're not oppositions, but different ways of orienting oneself or placing oneself in terms of why one is practicing or why one is turning one's life towards a more contemplative direction. One is what I call a horizontal and a vertical orientation. The horizontal orientation is one that is beneficial and applicable for many people. So it's the broad, contemporary modern mindfulness, taught everywhere, available to everybody, and it's largely oriented in a palliative direction. So the goal for most people, most of the time, when they take up a mindfulness practice, is alleviating some of the immediate suffering that they're experiencing in their lives. The other extreme or pole of that continuum would be a vertical orientation, which has to do with waking up, awakening, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, which from a contemplative tradition perspective would be the curative side of things, where you don't just, have a temporary alleviation of suffering, which is very important, and therefore, we don't want to, it's not a matter of thinking that it's a lesser form, but a more radical curative approach, curative perspective is a different one. So the motivation why people practice is significant for why they engage in particular kinds of practices and how they organize their lives around their contemplative practice, or how the contemplative dimension of their lives is actually realized. And of course, we have this traditional contrast between the monastics, professionals, so to speak, people who fully dedicate themselves to contemplative life, and lay people who, for the most part, have it as a secondary or it's an aspect of their lives, but it's not the full-time concern, because they also have, their ordinary work and family and so on. And again, those are, you could map those onto a continuum and say, okay, those are the two extremities. The one is where you live a full life in the world and you do a little bit of practice in whatever, or you try and be a decent human being, for example. The other extreme is lifelong retreat in a cave somewhere. So emergent forms take many forms, and that's a picture of our place here. Vexen. But as Stein Rast says, we're all contemplatives. And if we take that seriously, then, and I think we should, then it also means that, it's really important that there are places, and he talks about a monastery, of course, but places where people experiment in different kinds of ways with living a contemplative life with a greater emphasis on the contemplative aspect in the contemporary world. And the place where I live is one place where we're trying to do that. So this is not an advertising talk, but I want to talk a little bit about it because it raises a few questions perhaps that we could talk about. So the idea of the community where I live was originally, when it was founded in 1982, to develop and offer a secular spirituality, which should be open to anybody from any tradition. So the idea was that, a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist could come and receive inspiration, practices also that they might find useful and might want to use without there being a very, very normative worldview attached to it. Of course, there is a worldview in that as well, but it's open for people from different traditions. So the community, probably the largest group of people living here are the single largest is probably people in terms of how they orient themselves are probably Christians, and then there's a largish group of people who are non-traditional, non-confessional, I don't know what to call it, non-religious. And then there is a significant Buddhist group. So, and the idea with the place was to see if you want to bring these contemplative, some of these elements from contemplative traditions into a modern life. How might you do that? So let's try and see what we can do. And it wasn't started as a monastery, and it isn't a monastery really, but it has elements of that archetype, you could say. So a couple of basic sort of principles that are quite central is that democratic decision-making, but always with a caveat, because not everybody is in an elected position. There's gender equality, so very important balance between people, and a general respect for science. So it's not an anti-scientific community, which is why we're also engaged in scientific research. The basic pedagogy is that at the basis of contemplative practice, so the possibility of developing one's potential, human potential for more awakening, is self-development. So you need to integrate all aspects of who you are, including your negative sides, the sort of shadow work involved, sexuality, positive, negative emotions, and so on. And you take responsibility for them, and you try to look. Self-confrontation is a very important part of the process, and it never stops. And then there is contemplative training, sort of formal meditation training, which ranges all the way from mindfulness, stabilization, shamatha type practices to dzogchen. So what we can tell from this community, which has existed for a little more than 40 years now, is that even in a community like this, who orient themselves towards the same teacher, there is a huge diversity of how people actually live their lives and how they live their practice. So different people have different kinds of practices. This is the same in any Buddhist center that you could visit. Their orientations, what they are trying to, why they are there, what their ambitions are, how they've got there, where they're headed or where they think they're headed, and what actually happens in their lives is very individual. At the same time as we share this basic orientation towards our teacher and practice and awakening, or becoming slightly more pleasant in our interactions with others. We also have a huge experience with the challenges as well as the rewards of what we sometimes call interpersonal yoga, which is rubbing up against the other people in the community. So we're all, we're about 80 people, and the whole thing is organized through voluntary work. So yeah, and so it's there's lots of different, we have courses almost every weekend for people that are coming from outside happening. And it means that there's a lot of, there's the maintenance of the buildings, and some people go on retreat, and but that's your responsibility. Why didn't you do it? And why isn't the dining hall clean yet? And anybody who's lived in a community knows that these kinds of issues come up, and they're not a mistake, they're not a fault. They're the actual, one of the points of living in a community like that is that you get the daily rubbing. So practice isn't just the times when we sit together, sometimes together, in the meditation hall. There are 4 times a day where people can show up. Usually most people only show up once or twice a day, usually morning and late afternoon. That's where some of the formal practice happens, but the real practice is the existential work that you're doing continuously with each other and sometimes against each other. The basic, we have no vows, so we're not a BD. Some years ago, Thupten Children was visiting, and we talked about, monastic life, and I think maybe I mentioned or somebody else mentioned that, sometimes we call ourselves a lay monastery, and she was like, what do you mean monastery? Because we're not obedient, we're not, all these things that are usually involved. But in a way, the power of it is that there is no rule almost. So the one rule is that you pay your monthly subscription, your membership fee. And otherwise you're on your own. Once you've become a member, it takes a long time to become a member of the community, but once you're a member of the community, you're on your own. And in a sense, you're responsible for yourself. And people may nudge you and maybe sometimes talk to you about the fact that you're not living up to particular, you're doing your jobs, for example, in the community. But it's really your responsibility to work with that and do something. There are no sanctions, there is no expulsion or anything like that. So basic values are, simplicity. The whole point is simplifying your life. This is very difficult when you have kids, of course, and a career out in the world. But that's part of the ethos, is simplification. And so in a sense, self-confrontation, of course, self-relativization, and trying to be a little nice, which is not easy. A key element in it is the teacher-student relationship, which is both a source of incredible frustration and difficulties, but it's also sort of, why everybody is there in a sense. And it's something that hasn't really been studied at all, or very little in the research on contemplative life, other than in sociological terms. So, renunciation, orientation towards simplicity, serving others, and everything is self-organizing groups. We have consensus-oriented decision-making, and in general, this idea that we should be nice to each other and to the people outside in the city where we live, in the town where we live. So we can talk more about it if it's of interest. But the community that lives here is one. Like I said already, it's very diverse, but there is a certain shared commitment and shared practices. The organism is at the heart of a much larger network of people that come for courses or as visitors, and have been relating to the place maybe already for 50 years, because my teacher was teaching at the university before that, and as well as younger people that are beginning to come only now, and I think there's too many old people here. So there is this much larger group of people, and when you look out there, what are people doing with the inspiration that they're getting from contact with this kind of a community and having this example, just like you would if you meet monastics. So there's a lot of projection, thinking that we must be quite special, which is not the case. In some ways we are, maybe, but maybe not quite to the extent that some people seem to think. But otherwise, there's a lot of so there's a sense that this larger community is as important for what's happening with us as the other way around. So there is this mutual enrichment through the contact, through the circulation with society, and through circulation with people further out in the world. And of course, their conditions are all very, very different as well. So the basic idea that I was trying to convey is that we really need to keep this broad conception of contemplative life. So not, on the one hand, looking at the richness of practices and aspects of human existence that are part of a contemplative life, in addition to meditation. And at the same time, recognize the depth of, or the slowness of the path, or the depth of the tradition, the aspects of contemplative experience and contemplative practice that are not conducive to scientific study at this point, at least not in the ways that we've been doing. And so there is a reason to be respectful, but also humble on the side of the scientist. And that is a humility that sometimes I feel gets a little lost, not because the scientists aren't humble themselves personally, but because our society, takes scientific evidence as truth, and everything that is not evidence-based isn't worth, it doesn't really count, so to speak. And I think there really is a danger of an impoverished understanding of spiritual life, contemplative life. And so there is a responsibility from us that are working in this field as scientists and in the dialogue and trying to realize that also in our own lives, to keep reminding ourselves and others, the people that read our articles or that come to our meetings, of the importance of the scientific research that's being done, and also how little we actually still understand and are actually able to study, given the tools that we have at our disposal. So I think I'll leave it at that. There's a nice final quote from Brother David. This is the kind of thing that I think scientifically would be hard to measure, but it points to the relational aspect of contemplative life and contemplative experience, that it's always already relational, and this relationality is quite difficult to capture in the ways in which we've been looking at it and studying it so far. But I know Cliff is here, so I'm looking forward to having some of his input into this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martijn. Thank you so much. It's really touching to hear you. And I remember when we met 5 years ago, and I asked, we met at the airport waiting for a taxi to attend an AGM meeting in Brussels. And I asked where you live, and you started talking about this place. And since then, since 2018, I have been following your sharings. And I can see how each year you go deeper and deeper, not only in your practice, but also in your sharing. And it was wonderful to see this trajectory you shared with us. And while waiting for all our friends here asking questions from you, I would just ask maybe the first one, if you allow me.
Sure.
How did you change in this process over the years? Can you remember how you entered this way of life and how you are now compared to that? I know it's a difficult question.
I would much rather have somebody else to. You
Yes.
can ask Andreas. Andreas, actually, I can say something Andreas said there's a Danish expression that says, "Det er meget nemmere at være i samme rum med dig," which means it's much easier to be in the same room with you now. and I know exactly what he means, and I know how far there is still to go. But it was actually, Andreas has known me since Andreas Røbstorff has known me from a few weeks after I first arrived in Denmark in 1995, and a lot has happened since, both for him and for me. And so I think it's, like, honestly, I think, so one of the things, I don't think I had a slide that said that anymore, but one of the things that I really think we need are long-term studies of practitioners, life stories, and not only looking at their brains, but talking to people that have known them for a long time, people that are close to them, and people that maybe haven't seen them for a long time, but meet them again. And because that's, and then the question is still, how much is just aging and, calming down in general, going through the challenges of life and, the usual existential crises that help us grow when we're lucky. And so I think it would still be difficult to make very sharp causal analyses, but I think that's the kind of work that really would be great. And I once heard somebody say about Mathieu Ricard, somebody who'd known him for many, many years, who said that he really has changed a lot. He really, really has changed a lot. And I think that's the kind of testimony that you can count on, because the people that knew him before he became a monk and started practicing in the way that he has been practicing ever since. Yeah.
Thanks so much. I can see Annie and Amber. Maybe we can start with you, Annie.
Yes, I'll put two more items on the map. One of them is engaged Buddhism, which is a world movement, which was started by Thich Nhat Hanh, and Thich Nhat Hanh also invented part of mindfulness for Westerners, and Thich Nhat Hanh's mindfulness is different from mindfulness coming from the inside society, and it's very important to know the difference. The other thing is we have Buddhism coming to another culture, and when it comes to another culture, it hybridates. It's an hybridation, which means they invent new tools, there are different formulation, and that hasn't happened very visibly, but it's happening in some of us, and that's the other item I would put on the map, is people who are on a dual path. Yeah. Myself, I'm on a Jewish and Buddhist path, and if you're serious, it's bound to happen, because it's not just dealing with the rational mind, and it's also dealing with the conscious and subconscious aspect. And in the subconscious aspect, well, you have demons, you have emotions, and how do you deal with strong emotions? We talk about spirituality, but strong, dealing with what in the West, in Jungian terms, we call the shadow. And at some point you have to meet the shadow. That's our vocabulary. In Tibet, you do Che to deal with that. So that's part of it. But also my experience, at some point, you are, I don't know, even if you're not practicing, but if you're Jewish, at some point, the way I call it, I say our genes suddenly start speaking. So what do you do with that? So this question of being on a double path and at a higher level, the hybridation with Christianity, with Judaism, and with science, which is a lay religion for the West, it's that's what's up. That's why I think it's a very interesting period to live. And this is where I am. But this question, and for me, this raises also the question of method, skillful means, because in my, I've been Tibetan Buddhist for 40 years, and I watch, and I don't see people moving very much. So it doesn't seem much effective, and not a very, I don't see, there are a lot of skillful means around, and they're not used. For instance, in your community, do you use non-violent communication? Because that's a modern tool, which is, there are some tools. So, okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks. That I think all those things you said were really on to the point and important. So to start with the last thing, with nonviolent communication, it won't be a surprise to know that many of the people in my community are people that are either psychologists, psychotherapists, meditation teachers, yoga teachers, and at least one of them I know for sure has worked professionally for many years with nonviolent communication. So in the community, we managed to avoid, I think it's fair to say that they were reasonably good at avoiding very fierce conflicts, but it is not easy, and conflicts come up all the time. So the whole, the practice part of it is that you recognize your emotion and you don't express it as an emotion, but you try and, you don't push it down, you don't ignore it, but you say, you wait maybe, and then you try and say clearly what it is that is bothering you.
But you can do it because you're advanced practitioners, but
no, we're beginners.
But I'm talking about tools which can be used by ordinary people, quote unquote, not psychologists, no things, like, they teach mindfulness. These are basic things. And I've seen in this community, what did they take? Inside dialogue. And this is not a very effective tool for interpersonal. But I know, Gregory, I know that, I've had time to move around and meet various things. So in terms of really dealing with conflict and things like that, there's something everybody, these could be basic skills, interpersonal skills. That's what you need.
I mean, we like I said, we put a lot of emphasis. Well, I didn't say that, but we do put a lot of emphasis. I did say that on shadow work. So, and that takes many forms. And in the Tibetan tradition, of course, you have Tonglen, which is in a way, if you practice Tonglen in relationship to people that are difficult, you are actually doing shadow work in a Jungian sense, right? So, and of course, the Jungian part of it is that you recognize that whatever is bothering you in that other person is something that, is a quality you have yourself. You've just put it out on the other person.
The straw and what you say, in Christian terms, the straw and the beam.
Yeah, the beam in your own eye. And
it's well known.
Yeah. So,
okay. I'm so glad to meet you.
Well, nice to meet you too, and thank you for your question. And the history of mindfulness becoming widely understood in this very particular sense of mindfulness-based stress reduction, the formulation of Kabat-Zinn and Insight Meditation Society behind that, maybe. But there's a really good article that just came out. If you're interested in Tibetan Buddhism, there's a really good article by Marc-Henri de Roche and Michael Shee on mindfulness in, I forget what the title is, but it talks about mindfulness in all these different formulations in the Buddhist tradition, including in mindfulness, in Dzogchen. And it is one of the most lucid presentations that I've seen. And it comes also from, it's informed, I think, by an understanding of at least part of the practice side of it. So it's not just a theoretical article. And it's really good. I just read it a few days ago. It came out last year, I think, or 2 years ago, maybe even. So, and they have this parsing of all these different ways in which mindfulness is used in the Buddhist tradition, or some of the ways in which it is used.
I put my address in the chat, so I hope to get in touch with whoever wants to get in touch. Okay, thanks.
Welcome.
In the meantime, we are going to share the details of that article that Martin referred to. So Amber, thank you, Annie, for your question.
Yeah.
Amber, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. It was really interesting. I have a lot of sympathy for the dual aspects of what you were saying, sort of the acknowledgement of how valuable the scientific work that's been done already has been, but also what could we do, where could we go from there, and have a lot of sympathy for the suggestions you were making for how to broaden it out. It seems really important, actually, to get that more rounded view. But it occurred to me as you were talking that there's some really good reasons why the scientific work started where it did and as it did, because like brain waves are something concrete. We can measure something, we know what we're asking about and what we're looking for and what we see when we've seen it. And I know that simplifies things a lot, but the kinds of suggestions you were making, some of them, I think you even said that might not be possible to study that aspect of it. So I'm wondering, which are the things that you think could actually be pursued scientifically, and what sort of concrete form would that pursuit take? Because it wouldn't be studying brainwaves in a lab. It would probably be something more sociological or anthropological. It seems to me, standing pretty far outside of it, that there's pressure within sociology towards the quantitative rather than the qualitative. But it sounds like also the sorts of things you were suggesting would really demand a qualitative kind of approach. So I just wondering if you could say something more about the specific things and specifically how one would go about studying them.
So it's a difficult question, and as far as real science is concerned, I think Cliff will have a, a suggestion or two. We've had this conversation a few times. Too many variables, but I agree. It's qualitative work, and it's ethnographic, not necessarily as anthropological ethnographic work. Could be sociological. I'm not so disciplinarily constrained. I don't think one should be too constrained by discipline, but life story, long-term study, not studies. Well, if you want to do a more scientific study, following people over a long period of time is a very good thing to do, and then studying, doing life story interviews and talking to people who've known people for many years, I think is worth doing. And of course, from a scientific point of view, it's all biased, and what's the relationship between the people and so on. But I think we really lack, in a Tibetan context, namtar. So the stories of the lives and the awakening, or the re-realization of teachers, it's a huge source of inspiration. And we've now got a number of really good translations and studies of relatively recent masters and female masters also, that are really worth reading, because they tell us something about at a more human level, even though these are namtas and to some extent they're hagiographical. Some of these more recent studies that have come out show us something about the people that these people were. And I think we need more, like Brother David wrote or said, we shouldn't put them on a pedestal. And in a way, you need to put them on a pedestal because that's their function. But we need to understand that when we put them on a pedestal, what we're putting on the pedestal is not the actual person, but what that person symbolizes or represents, or whatever. At least from a Jungian perspective, I guess. But having more, concrete stories about concrete people and concrete communities and what happened, how people's lives have expressed what they aspire to practice, I think would be really valuable, because when it becomes numbers, you get the game that Thomas Merton was pointing out, which is that people then start looking at, why am I not getting this? And when you read a text, the texts are always addressing, usually not all texts, but many texts in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition are often addressing, or talking about people of very advanced, with a lot of training, with a lot of experience. And so the kinds of descriptions that we find there are often not quite appropriate for people like us who are just putting our baby steps on the path. And then we get caught up in looking at, where do I fit on this path? And on the one hand, it is important to have somebody, fellow travelers or a teacher, to help you be more realistic about how it's going, to help you see that. But in a way, it's only you yourself who can really do that. And by putting our faith in science, so looking at the measurement rather than the personal experience of transformation, however small way, it's a logical thing to do for people in the West and around the world nowadays, but it may not be a very productive one in all circumstances. Let's put it that way. I'm not sure if I answered your question. But...
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Amber. Carolina.
Thanks a lot. Like really, really thanks a lot. And a lot of movement inside along the talk and also about the collective. Two main things that brings somehow in my mind while listening, or my heart, I don't know. It's like the value of the collective, and the kind of the collective consciousness also, that somehow I have the feeling that it's not explicitly addressed in some of the techniques that are now pretty widespread. That it's true that many of the activities or the practices are done by group, but this part of it's, at least to me, it's non-tangible, but how the improvement, it's like a way in another level, even like quantic level, if it's in a collective. And also the achievement or not achievement, I don't know about the others, but it's like, if while practicing or advancing, if, at least in my case, if I go into the achievement, it's not the way. It's while in science, it is the way. It's like, if we focus on the mind and the rational part and to reach whatever goal, while in contemplative practice and work, it's just the opposite. It's like the less that I go, the more that I reach. I don't know if I am expressing myself properly, but it's like kind of one day, for whatever reason or whatever work that you have been doing, you reach the people in a different way, for example, while you are speaking or while you are acting or even just being present. And to me, this is not possible to measure, but it's the way to achieve that approaches and goals. Like, I'm thinking now in climate or biodiversity or so on, and I've been working on that super hard for my whole life, but now I'm reaching the results, but not because of the science, I think, but because of the contemplative practices and approaching. And sometimes I feel it's not like even speaking, it's just with my presence, which is very difficult to measure, or maybe we cannot even measure. And that's part of the messages that I fully agree are not on the table even. Like, we are so focusing on measuring things that we can measure, but maybe we can accept also that there are things that cannot be measured.
Yeah. I mean, there's work on emotional contagion, for example, which would be relevant for the kinds of things that you were talking about. But that's really not, I know nothing about the literature. Again, Cliff, but yeah, we all know from our own experience that when we're in a room together with somebody, or somebody comes in who's extremely excited, positively or negatively, it affects us immediately. And similarly, if you're feeling, out of yourself, is that something you can say in English? When what you need is not somebody to also sort of get all excited, but somebody who's calm, and that calmness will help you calm down. So that even that kind of simple process, we know from our own experience, has an effect. So cultivating the capacity to be less at the mercy of your emotions, positive or negative, is a really, really valuable skill, not only for yourself, but for others. And when you think about it more collectively, when you think about the function that churches have had historically, or temples or monasteries in other contexts, in the Tibetan context, for example, there are places in principle also where people's agenda is a different one, and you can find it's hard in Tibetan monasteries sometimes, or Western monasteries, maybe also, I don't know, Father Francis may have more on that, but where you can meet stillness and quietness and contemplate. And Thomas Merton somewhere said that everybody needs silence once in a while, and silence is an inner phenomenon in the end. It's not an outer phenomenon. But places where people dedicate themselves to contemplative practice, where a stable community over a long period of time has been practicing, historically those places have always been seen as important by communities, and we've kind of, for all sorts of reasons, lost that perspective maybe. And from one idea in our community is that one function that we have is very simply that we are a place where people can come and spend a few days and get inspiration and go home, and hopefully they can use some of that in their daily lives as inspiration or as concrete practices or whatever. And having places like that, I think, is important. And they don't have to be traditional monasteries. They can be other kinds of communities, and there are many of these kinds of communities around the world. Of course, we're just one of them. But these collective aspects, I think there is a very a mundane kind of commonsensical kind of way in which, like I said, when Gabo asked me about like how have I changed, it's best to say that somebody says it's a little easier to be in the same room with me. So I've calmed down a little bit, which is nice, and I think it's true, but I've also grown a lot older. So, thanks.
Thank you, Carolina. Cliff.
Thank you so much, Martijn, for this beautiful talk, and for all the comments that have come since. There's a tremendous resonance in me to both the firmament from where Mind and Life dialogues and things like this have come, because I was a bit around in those early days. And also there's a sense, another quote from Francisco that I think is important to bring up, and that is that his mention in Monte Grande, this interview with Joan Halifax, that science in its purest, most earnestly taken up sense is pure contemplation.
Mm.
It has nothing to do with what he called manipulation.
Mm.
And when we are looking at the edifice and the exponential growth of contemplative science, which itself is an umbrella term that is kind of allowed for career building as well as a lack of confusion, but it covers a multitude of different kinds of efforts. there is a sense that it is connected to proving something or to demonstrating effectiveness. And so I think that's a very important distinction, because the thing that really jumped out for me that you talked about was Francisco said, science must change. And I completely think that that's true. And so when we talk about what we can measure, there's a whole realm of creativity and effort, which requires dollars or euros or pounds or whatever, that is enormously labor intensive.
Yep.
That for many practical purposes, if you ask for it, this isn't the mandate of a widely, easily deployed intervention that will give rapid results. So there's a piece of the sociology. Another piece is the way the population at large understands the science, comes often through press releases and articles. And the variability in the data is not communicated. There are sound bites like average effects, but the strength of those effects and what might be transformative for person X leaves person Y cold, or in fact, worse off and feeling unsafe based on a whole host of situations where the teacher and the student feel othered in the environment of training students. So I think while there are experiments that can be creatively engineered to measure many more things than are parts of the traditions of psychological and neuroscience, those traditions of measurement operate on very different sets of fundamental questions. And so there is a big mismatch fundamentally between a lot of the training of investigators and the integration of personal wisdom as it grows. And if you put that at the top end of a grant and say, I'm fundamentally committed to uncovering a little tiny, tiny speck of a vast mystery, it's not a hard, that's a hard sell. So those are some initial thoughts.
Thanks, Cliff. I mean, on the last point, I think that's what is one of the main functions of Mind and Life Europe and Mind and Life Institute, is to create spaces where at least we can have these kinds of conversations and offer a community to the people that are aspiring or actually working with these kinds of perspectives. And even though that kind of, the kind of science that one would ideally wish for isn't really feasible right now in most situations for most people, but the fact that we have this aspiration, and the fact that, if you look at what's happened since 1983, since Altbach, just to start there, it's tremendous. It's 40 years almost, but it really is remarkable, both in terms of the science and the interest in meditation study, in research in meditation as a legitimate topic of study, and in the way it's spread in society. I mean, it really, Jean Kabat-Zinn calls it a new renaissance, I think. And I think that may be true in 150 years. Right now, I think it's still an uphill struggle. But it really, there's something to be happy about when we look back and look at what's been accomplished. And I think the nudging that Mind and Life does, and other people and organizations are doing to try and move science, or move funders and move academia in the right direction, it's slow going, but it's necessary. And Andreas Rupshoff, my colleague, is now in charge of a large school in our university, and just him being in that position doesn't change the whole system, but it does affect how people look at each other and at the system in the university. So slowly, things may begin to shift. And like with the establishment of Buddhism in Tibet, you know, it takes hundreds of years. So why would we think it would go quickly to reintroduce a culture of contemplation where it's been so marginalized for so long? But yeah, thanks. I really appreciate your comments.
As a very practical, quick note, we have a Mind and Life grant, Quinn Conklin in my lab as a postdoctoral fellow, to actually make our shiny apps that allow for large studies, raw data, to be accessible to anyone to look at and actually investigate that variability that doesn't wind up being published or known otherwise.
Yeah.
For a whole study on people using their contemplative practice to cope with the pandemic.
Mm.
That's, stay tuned for more things like that.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Cliff, for joining and also for this comment and question. I can see several comments in the chat, but I also saw your hand, Leslie. Shall we look at those questions in the chat first and then come back to you, Leslie, or would you like to ask your question now?
I keep putting my hand up and putting it down because I'm not sure how to formulate my question. Thank you, Martijn. It was absolutely wonderful. I'm bouncing off of Amber, the way Amber posed her question, and Cliff hi Cliff. Cliff just spoke to it very eloquently. The way it comes to my mind is about quantifying. I'll put these two words together. The question about quantifying transformation. Cliff spoke very eloquently, suggesting, or what I heard is that there are ways to do this, can be formulate studies, but and I love, Martijn, how you speak to stories, because I can imagine the importance of stories expressing transformation and the effects of the contemplative life. But I get a little bit lost when I try and understand the significance or the importance of trying to quantify transformation, measure the spirit, measure the psyche, numbers. That I have a hard time with that. So I just don't know if you have anything else to say. Several people have spoken to it, but if you have anything to say, I would love to hear it. Thank you.
Not really.
It's a vast subject.
Yeah,
and you know where I'm coming from. I'm coming from the perspective of depth psychology and psychoanalysis.
yeah.
You've spoken as the shadow, and those are things that we reach and touch when we are in the contemplative life. But how to measure, why to measure?
I mean, I think Cliff would be more the right person to answer, maybe. I mean, one immediate answer I would have is that, well, because that's what opens the door in many cases. So the measurements and the evidence has an important role to play, but it has its limits. I mean, measurement doesn't tell us anything about meaning, but looking at measurements sometimes gives meaning to people. It makes sense. Cliff?
Very quickly, the thought that came to mind was paint by numbers. So the whole enterprise of trying to get an understanding of some phenomenon is to be able to peg some locations compared to other locations in a vast map of models. And so our collective intersubjective understanding accretes through hundreds of thousands of instances of communication events that single one of which are determinative of a community understanding. But I think it's important to consider the quantitative as another reflection of a qualitative understanding of nature.
Good point.
That's my current whatever in response to that.
I had two quick follow-up. One is sparked by what you were saying, Cliff, that from a certain perspective, any kind of conceptualization is a move away from what it's all about, at least when I read and hear what the texts say and the teachers tell me. But it is how we manage to live together, which is also important. So we need, we know that even our most elaborate concepts fall short of what we're trying to express, always by definition, I guess. So that's just but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be using them. I mean, they're very useful, and I think it's the same with science. The problem is that we begin to mistake the model for the reality, for the world, and that's a fundamental problem. This engineering perspective on the planet and on life and on society and so on is fundamentally flawed if we forget that it is an abstraction. There is this whole notion of the violence of abstraction, that any kind of abstraction is an act of violence in a particular kind of perspective. The other thing I just wanted to say was something Annie had said earlier and that I didn't answer or didn't respond to, which was your point about how do we dual paths and acknowledging the fact that or being confronted with the fact that one has one is part of a history and a culture and so on. And I'm always inspired by His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, spending so much time when he addresses people from not historically Buddhist countries to explain why it's important they don't convert to Buddhism, or at the very least, that they respect and acknowledge and take seriously the spiritual traditions in their own cultural heritage. And in my community, it's one of the fundamental principles that even though the main practice is Dzogchen, there is as I said, there is a very large proportion, a large proportion of people that have a more explicit sort of Christian orientation, and the kinds of symbols that they might use when they do certain kinds of practices that speak to their hearts are Christian ones, whereas for some of us they're Buddhist ones. And for yet other people, it might be love or light or whatever. And so people use whatever resonates with them. But trying to ignore the fact that you have grown up in a society which is so heavily a product historically of, for example, Christian theology and Christian practices, Christian ways of understanding oneself and others. Is at least it's not wise to try and ignore that. How one then deals with that, I think, is very individual. And one of the ways I deal with it is recognizing Brother David's wisdom. And I remember the session at Fürstenfeldbruck at the Contemplative Science Symposium, or whatever it was called, Mind and Life Europe. Mind Life Institute and Mind Life Europe, I think, were organizing it. And there was this wonderful dialogue between Brother David. Well, first of all, Brother David was fantastic on stage and got everybody to stand up and sing in canon, a canon. But he had this wonderful dialogue with Roshi Joan Halifax. And I remember Brother David talking about how all that the different spiritual traditions basically are drilling. They're like wells. They drill down and they finally reach the water, and basically different traditions are drilling holes, and but in the end they're all tapping into the same water. And he said to Roshi Joan, he said, and I think that's Buddha nature. And I thought that was a very, very beautiful way of phrasing it. And personally, I think, of course. I have no evidence to back that up, but I think it's a convincing it's a very productive way of looking at it. And it shows something about, I think it's important so what I've heard is that you really need to, not just go for one thing and give it time and try different things and see what speaks to your heart and so on. But at some point it becomes more and more important to commit to a particular practice, a particular teacher, if you really want to get a little further. And I think there is wisdom in that, because otherwise you end up being very, very confused because you're hopping from one thing to another. But it should be based on experience and a personal process of discovery and recognition, And along the way, things will come up that we then need to deal with. And that may mean what may look like a detour from one perspective, but for you, it is not a detour. It's absolutely necessary.
I can see three more questions besides the great comments in the chat that I would like to spend a little time on still, if you have time, maybe 5-6 more minutes.
Sure.
And start with Ruben's. That's probably the most challenging one, and then Father Francis, and finally Catherine Bastian Ventura needed to leave earlier. I will read her question as the last one, which may be probably the good conclusion for tonight. So Ruben.
Thanks, Gabriel, and thanks, Martijn, for the wonderful talk. Just wondering about the links between politics and contemplative practice, and just thinking as background of my question is David Graeber's and David Wengrow's kind of invitation to rekindle our political, social imaginations. So yeah, how do you see things? Not sure if you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always in awe of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who calls George Bush Jr. his good friend, and sits on the stage with L.K. Advani, the former Home Minister in India, with an interesting Hindu nationalist background and so on. So His Holiness makes this point, I think, of having contact with all these people, because it's important to show them something, I guess, about how you can relate to people, and maybe it has a little effect. I think, what is it, Congressman, one of the Ryans in the US, Tim Ryan, right? Yeah, not Paul Ryan. Many parliaments, so there are many parliamentary groups in Europe and around the world where people come together and practice mindfulness, and I think that's a really, really, really good thing. It's like people in the business world discovering mindfulness, and they may, it may be used by Amazon in little cubicles to keep people productive and not go mad, however the motivation may be. But the fact that practice is a contemplative perspective, an orientation towards the whole, towards wholeness, as David Bohm might phrase it, I think is extremely important. And I think the challenge. This is something His Holiness was saying also, right? So our this is not His Holiness's word, this is my words, but I think it's a similar point. Our ordinary reaction when we feel pressured is to close up and build walls and hoard the resources and build up armies, all the stuff that's happening in the world just now. And I think His Holiness would probably say, as I've heard him say in other contexts, that's very short-sighted. It may be necessary in the short term to prevent a lot of suffering, but in the long run it's very counterproductive. So when I look at the history of if you look at the context that this whole new paradigm thinking came out of, which was this post-World War II crisis and the Cold War and thermonuclear destruction and so on, and we look at the current conjuncture of environment, climate change, war in Europe again for the first time since a long time, and this large-scale kind of war. It's a very similar situation, and politics has to be part of the solution. And so working with politicians and politicians coming in contact with these kinds of ideas is absolutely crucial. And if you art meets science and spirituality in a changing economy in Amsterdam, I know there were politicians involved in that, former politicians, but still high-ranking members of the Dutch political establishment. And His Holiness, of course, makes a big point of visiting politicians whenever he gets a chance. So I'm not sure that I'm at all addressing the kind of issue that you were asking about, but for me, in a changing economy shouldn't be the last word. It should be, the politics that art meets science and spirituality in a changing economy. If all of that is part of what needs to happen in order to produce a better world, politics is part of that. It's not like it should be part of that. It is part of that. It's a political movement from the beginning.
Thank you, Martijn.
Thank you indeed. Father Francis.
Yeah, my question was quite similar because I've been thinking about the fact that we can do study and research and teaching. So there's kind of an academic component to what we do as Mind in Life, and then also there is the contemplative part, which I think have been able to illustrate beautifully in this talk, that it is contemplative living, and that one can choose and one can engage with that. There's a third component, which is the, we might call the outreach or the outflow. Brother David's comment about a radiation from the center of contemplative life into the wider horizon. And I've been trying to think about how to do that. One model, of course, traditionally, if you go to the really very strictly contemplative orders in the Catholic Church, and also to some extent, I mean, you see this in the Orthodox monastic tradition, the monastic community radiates outward a subtle energy of light and life, which touches people's lives on a subtle level, all right? And to the degree they have an open heart to that, they receive it consciously. There's another way of doing this, of course, and that is that the monastery becomes a kind of host where things can be discussed as we are doing, that create the space in which a conversation can take place, and in which as I envisioned it, if you improve the quality of human relationships through contemplative living, you are also going to not just improve, but activate the possibility of creating projects and programs that really do have an impact on society. And so that's kind of what I was getting at with my question, what's the relationship between the community of contemplative living and the wider social horizon? And how to make that concrete, how to make that real.
I think you just answered it yourself
Yeah.
very eloquently, because there is historically, so one is that when you look at the lives of individual contemplatives, there may be periods in which they are more in seclusion and in a more, and in periods where they are more engaged in the world, for example, and some people stay in one form for long periods of time or for their entire lives. So monastic traditions or contemplative traditions in general always have had a series of offerings, so to speak, both for the contemplatives, but also in their engagement with the world. And I remember that I think it is the case that some of the Tibetan masters that came out of Tibet were quite inspired by, for example, the way in which care of the sick, social work and so on, being done by contemplatives was something that wasn't a major part of the tradition in Tibet, but it became, an element, at least for some teachers who came out, establishing clinics and so on, as part of the monastery circulation with the wider community. I think a place like Mind and Life, or a community like Mind and Life, I think it's exactly as you're saying, that the coming together of people in this kind of conversation and in the contact with one another inspires projects and inspires people doing things in their own lives, both in very, very day-to-day kinds of interaction kind of things, and then the larger, having a vision of some project like Cliff's what was it, the Shamatha project and so on. So both in science and in social work and politics and so on. So I think, when we think about Mind and Life, Europe's impact, for example, I think it's important to show our supporters that when you take this broader view of what is that people that have come through or have been part of the dialogue, what kinds of things are they doing out in the world? which isn't funded necessarily at all by Mind and Life, or it doesn't necessarily have to do directly with contemplative work, but where you can see that, something is being expressed. And one of the things that I always find really interesting is the ways in which, I think one of the things that's really worth looking at and studying more systematically, perhaps, is the kinds of life choices people make when they have begun to practice more formally, or when they've been, in contact with a place like Mind and Life, a community like Mind and Life, or a person like His Holiness. Of course, there are many, many examples of very, very beautiful and dramatic changes that people make in their lives. And so I think those kinds of, in a sort of homeopathic way, as you were saying, the blessings, the light, the ways in which we inspire each other and the world at large. I think that's where the real, the real work is, in a way. Of course, there's very concrete interactions as well, but this things you would say Auslese-effekte, the sort of longer term and further away, the ways and one of the things that is interesting when you, like I just did these last couple of weeks, digging deeper again in the prehistory of the Mind and Life project, is you can see so many of the same people and these cross connections that have led to these different kinds of, people coming with different kinds of projects already. John Kabat-Zinn and others arriving with their own work, and it coming together, and then there are certain teachers, people that are like nodes in these networks that pop up in many contexts. Brother David is one, Tunku Urgyen is one, Trigum Trungpa in his way was one, so many people like that. And I think it's interesting how these, if we use an active perspective and a dynamic understanding of how these processes work, it makes perfect sense that we don't have, we don't have bricks that sort of build a machine. We have much more subtle and dynamic processes of inspiration that set real, effects in the world.
Yeah,
that's a very long way of saying the same thing that you said.
I'm glad you're doing it. Sometimes to know that someone else is really making this effort is a great encouragement to those of us who are also making a similar effort, especially when we run into a brick wall. I've been going through a lot of brick walls lately, so it's great. Thank you. Thank you.
I know it was a long day for you, Martijn, so thank you so much for this talk. The last question was Catherine's. She will reach out to you individually as well. She mentioned to me before leaving. And the question is very simple. What do you mean when you speak of simplicity?
Do you want me to answer it?
A simple one.
So my teacher says that there's only one real instruction, and it's renunciation. And when you think about it, that's actually true. And renunciation in the sense of not holding on. So it's a different way of saying groundlessness. And so simplicity is anything that, a friend of mine, so here's a friend of mine who is in his third 3-year retreat. He says, simplification is really not complicated. But it's difficult because we have spun these webs, that we live in and that we're caught in. And so I tell my students at university that they should think twice when they create commitments to banks, for example, and other kinds of ways. So simplification is basically creating freedom for yourself, and freedom comes from uncluttering, not only in terms of things, but in terms of the things that you spend your time on. And it's harder and harder because we're getting, our phones and screens, and so simplification is the recipe for everything, really, I think. No, don't quote me on that. That's too. But from a contemplative perspective, I think it's true, or it works, something like that.
Thank you so much, Martijn. that and for the whole evening, for the talk, for the answers to the questions. As you can see, we have had a very lively dialogue with lots of questions raised live or shared in the chat. And we are happy to have you in our community, and also the retreats and the other programs you offer to all the young students and our members, Mind and Life Europe. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for showing up and playing along. It was really nice to be together and talk together. Inspiring.
Thank you, Johanna, for organizing this event, and I'm going to share the end slide so that you can share what is awaiting us the coming days, weeks.
It looks like we're on that. There we go. Okay. Thanks again, Martijn. As many of you know, we are knee-deep into semester 2 of our Core in Action program. And so we'll be having our 3rd session on chapter 3 of the Embodied Mind next Wednesday, March 22nd at 6 p.m. Central European Time. And Dr. Marieke van Vugt, who's also an association member of MLE, will be giving the presentation. And you're welcome to tune in on our YouTube channel. We'll be live streaming it in addition to the live classroom that we have of about 40 students or so, participants rather. And then on March 30th, we have the first talk of this new season of the EVA Alumni Talks. So these are basically talks that feature alumni of the European Varela Awards program, offering some insights into their research project and where they've taken their career in contemplative science. So you're also welcome to join this talk. And so our first speaker will be Dr. Anna Isaac-Reeves, who's based in Israel and who did a really interesting project on mindfulness and refugee mental health. So please join us for both of these if you're able, and we'll keep you apprised of future MLE Friends talks by email as well. So thank you so much for joining, and thanks again, Martijn, for this really, really fulsome talk and dialogue this evening. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, Martijn. Thank you all.
Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye-bye. Great to be here.
Thanks.
Great.